All right, Psalm 110, let's call this one a red flag for contentment. Understanding that as I read through this psalm this time, I began to realize that as I mature, my moments of genuine contentment seem to be attached to my moments of genuinely being able to wait on God at peace. And that's a concept we've talked about before, but not in the context of this very famous psalm that begins in verse 1. The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my hand until I make your enemies your footstool. A quote that's repeated in Jesus' own ministry in all of the synoptic gospels. That means all the ones that essentially parallel the story in the same way. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and not so much John. John is a gospel that follows a different pattern, but the synoptic gospels, Matthew at chapter 22, verse 41, Mark at chapter 12, verse 35, and Luke at chapter 20, verse 41, all quote this statement from David. And it's Jesus quoting it, saying that David in the spirit wouldn't necessarily be able to appreciate this, but he was pointing forward to a Christ, somebody he never met, who would also draw on this same concept of waiting. Where David is going to go on to say in verse 2, the Lord sends forth from Zion your mighty scepter. Rule in the midst of your enemies. And he's going to go on to talk about the ways in which David was going to have a level of security where he was going to be content, whether or not he was surrounded by enemies or whether or not he was surrounded by friends. Beyond that, it's going to go on to say in verse 3, your people will offer themselves freely, meaning in the days of his reign, he was no longer going to have to struggle with the resentment of men like Saul. He was going to see a time of peace where everyone was simply going to be on the same page, moving in the same direction, offering themselves freely. And beyond that, he was not going to have to worry about the clock or the time limit placed upon his reign, because it's going to say in verse 4, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek. Another quote that's stated later on in the New Testament about Jesus and the longevity of his reign. And so beyond all that, the psalm is going to end up talking about the level of work God was going to have to put in to bring David and ultimately his Christ that level of contentment. Bringing to mind this illustration, if I was put in a position where I had to unfortunately fight, but I had the opportunity to have somebody like Mike Tyson in his prime fight for me, I would be super foolish to want to go into that fight on my own, understanding that I could probably never whoop my adversary the way that Mike Tyson could. Now, God forbid I ever have to fight again, because I'm an old man, but it would be nice to know that I had somebody like Mike Tyson. You pick your favorite fighter to fight for you. And so sometimes when I get frustrated and fixated on what seems like an injustice in my life, I want to correct it so much that I forget that as bad as Mike Tyson might be able to whoop somebody, he can't do it the way God could, because all he can do is fight with these and maybe whatever resources he has as a man of clout. But God has more than strength. He has clout that fixes things like the elements, situations in the economy, things that are beyond us, in ways that create the level of stability that he has promised to his servant David, and likewise to his Christ. Because for David, as long as he endured his period in the wilderness the right way, God was going to create the peace for him. Psalm 110 quite possibly reminding me that a red flag for my genuine contentment may be seen in the degree to which I realize that I need to stop fighting battles better fought by Mike Tyson. My fault. Battles better fought by God. Going back to our bus metaphor from Psalm 108, simply seeking his guidance to help me position myself in places where he's willing to fight the battles for me.